They called it New Haven, a dome city carved into a world whose name I'd long forgotten. I was one of the first wave of settlers, a young fool back then, suckered by the promise of a life free from the squalor, the endless wars that still tore what remained of Earth apart. That had been 15 solar cycles ago, and I hadn't laid eyes on our ruined homeworld since. My memories of the initial years are blurry, a haze of bland contentment that only sharpened into focus once the chip went in. The surgeons, with their sterilized smiles and mechanical voices, called it a neuroregulator. Supposed to optimize us, they said. Keep the peace on this fragile new world. Bulldust. It was a leash, pure and simple. Before, there were arguments, shouting matches in the mess hall, fistfights in the muddy alleys that passed for streets back then. People with fire in their bellies, desperate ambition, and that dangerous spark of wanting more. The architects of this so-called utopia couldn't have that, could they? Once everyone was chipped, things changed. The voices that rose in dissent lowered into mumbles, then faded entirely. Gone were the hungry-eyed schemers, the men who'd challenge, question, push. Our colony became a place where the worst crime was cutting in line or a missed workday. Meals tasted bland, a manufactured substitute for any kind of flavor. My dreams lost their jagged edges, replaced by vague, muted landscapes. The woman I'd been chasing, fiery and ambitious like I used to be. Her laughter turned hollow, her eyes distant. Even the stars glimpsed through the dome's transparency looked less brilliant with the chip humming behind my ear. It whispered complacency into my skull, muffled rage, and blunted every instinct that said this wasn't right. I want to believe there was a day, a moment when I decided, enough. Honestly, it was more of a slow burn, a resentment stoked by the nagging suspicion that something wasn't just wrong with New Haven, something was wrong with me. There are whispers about those who've gone feral, exiles who dared remove their regulators and were cast out into the harsh wilderness beyond the city limits. We're told they devolve into mindless, violent creatures. Maybe they're right. But the thought of becoming some snarling beast out in the wilds? It almost seemed better than staying here, a half-alive ghost in this gilded cage. That whisper about the ferals, the exiles, it became a fixation, a pinprick of light in the smothering darkness of my manufactured contentment. They existed, proof there was life beyond the soul-crushing obedience the chip demanded. It began with subtle deviations from my routine. A lingering glance towards the wall during my work shift, a detour into a shadowed side corridor instead of my usual route home. The dome was riddled with them, maintenance tunnels, storage shafts, places where a man could disappear for a while, if only to breathe air that didn't smell recycled, feel a shiver that wasn't the over-conditioned chill of the living quarters. One evening, instead of rolling over and waiting for the blessed numbness of sleep, I slipped out of bed. In the dim glow of the communal quarters, everyone slept in the same synchronized rhythm of drugged peace. I padded silently to the door, heart thrumming in my chest, not with fear, but a kind of exhilaration I hadn't experienced in years. The corridor stretched long and empty. Somewhere in my skull the chip throbbed a warning, a buzzing discord against the sudden surge of adrenaline. I ignored it, fingers tracing the seams of access panels until one gave way with a rusty groan. Inside, darkness thick as tar. But in that darkness a spark of rebellious hope ignited. For weeks the tunnel became my sanctuary. I crawled its claustrophobic depths, scraping knees, skinning knuckles. Dust coated my borrowed coveralls. The faint metallic tang of old machinery clung to my skin. But each night, I returned a little less tamed, a little more aware of the cage I rattled against. Then came the meeting. A stumble in the shadows, a pair of eyes gleaming with a feral intensity. He was older, gaunt, scars crisscrossing his face. An exile, undoubtedly. But instead of the slavering creature of the propaganda tapes, he spoke with a clarity. Words like truth, freedom, awakening. Dangerous words the chip in my head could barely translate. His name was Bane. Once, he said, he'd been a supervisor, a man with influence in the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of our world. Then he started noticing the discrepancies, the gaps in the mandated reports, the faint tremors under the surface of this enforced tranquility. Like me, the dissatisfaction had bloomed within him, until one day he cut the chip out. They'd hunted him, chased him to the very edge of the dome. In the struggle, his wife had died. He escaped, scarred and alone, into the wilderness. And that was where the choice landed squarely in my lap. Join him? He offered. There was a way, a gamble with a slim chance of survival, or stay and wither away under the relentless thrum of the chip, waiting for the day I'd transform into just another hollow-eyed drone, content until the world ended. The choice hammered in my skull, a relentless, discordant drumbeat against the regulator's enforced tranquility. Every time I looked to the wall, a vision of myself joined the silhouettes etched against the pale light, stumbling, bleeding, free. Every time I trudged through the dome's manicured pathways, I saw my reflection warp and distort, a beast in human skin, snarling and tearing at its chains. I was no fool. Bane hadn't painted a rosy picture. Death out there is quick, he'd rasped, the light etching shadows under his sharp cheekbones. Starvation, the beasts, or the wardens if you're unlucky. But here, your death will be slow, piece by agonizing piece. And he was right. I could already feel myself unraveling. The tastelessness of the food, the bland conversations, the repetitive cycles of work and mandated rest grated on me like nails against stone. Fear had kept me compliant for so long. Now it twisted, morphing into something new. Fear of not becoming a feral, but of becoming something far worse. A ghost haunting my own existence. It took me 3 days. 3 days of watching the inhabitants, my comrades, with an outsider's detachment. 3 days of fighting the traitorous whispers of the chip, begging for the sweet comfort of surrender. 3 days until I left a note on my empty cot. Off shift early. Just vague enough to allow for plausible deniability, to buy me a head start if they ever checked. That final walk to the outer access panel felt like a march to the execution block. My hands trembled, but with determination, not terror. Each step was a proclamation, a rejection of the careful order that had been my prison. Bane waited in the shadows beyond the portal. He gave a curt nod, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his scarred lips. Then he led me away from the city, its lights an ever-shrinking island behind us, towards a world coloured in shades of grey. The first breath of unfiltered air was a shock. It tasted acrid and raw, tainted by the lingering toxins of whatever had laid waste to this planet. It also tasted of possibility. Each crunch of the barren earth under my boots was a hymn to my newfound rebellion. I kept up with the older man, my lungs burning. There was no time for weakness, not with the wardens, the city's enforcers, potentially on our heels. Survival, Bane explained as we stumbled deeper into the plains, would be a lesson in brutality. We scavenged, scrounging for any meager sustenance the wasteland offered. We hid, finding shelter in the broken bones of structures long reduced to rubble. The lingering stench of decay, a constant reminder of the price of failure. This was no swift passage to a resistance haven, no romanticized tale of a rebel army ready to overthrow the tyrants. This was the gritty underbelly of defiance, where the only ideals left were to stay alive and stay unchipped. Days passed in a grueling cycle of hunger and thirst. My hands, once accustomed to the sterile tools of my trade, blistered and cracked, stained brown by the dirt and grime of an unforgiving landscape. Sleep came in snatches, haunted by the shrieks of unseen creatures that roamed in the darkness and the ever-lingering spectre of the wardens closing in. Bane was a harsh tutor, yet a necessary one. He taught me to identify the meager vegetation that was edible amidst the thorny shrubs and poisonous blossoms. We collected dew, water dripping painfully slowly from leaves into crudely fashioned vessels. He showed me how to fashion traps from vines and salvaged scraps of metal, snares for the small, skittering creatures that were our only source of meat. The whine of the absent Chip had faded into a distant, ignorable annoyance. My senses, once dulled by the dome's manufactured perfection, now screamed with new awareness. Every rustle of the wind through the bleached bones of the dead world, every shift in the dust pattern on the ground became vital information. Then came the first test. We'd been tracking a scrawny, rabbit-like creature for hours, its tracks a jagged trail on the cracked earth. When it finally appeared, a flash of fur and panic, it wasn't a clean catch. The creature screamed, thrashing wildly against the snare. Bane looked at me, his face a mask etched with harsh lines, and with a curt nod, handed me a sharpened length of salvaged metal. It wasn't the killing that sickened me. Years of processed rations had dulled any squeamishness. It was the sheer rawness of the act, the blood spraying my hands, the way the creature's eyes filmed over with the finality of death. Bane watched, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of sentiment. "Welcome to the real, boy. Your pretty little dome never prepared you for this." And he was right. It had softened me, filled me with a sanitized delusion of the world's function. Now I was face to face with the brutal reality, the foundation upon which existence was built. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. There was no counsel to appeal to, no moral code to hide behind. Every breath I took was a fight, a defiance against a world that had no interest in my survival. Yet, as the carcass roasted over a pitifully small, carefully controlled fire, I knew I'd made the right choice. The first bite was tough, stringy, and tasted of freedom. Weeks melted into one another, measured by the height of the sun and the emptiness of our stomachs. The harsh beauty of the wasteland became an oppressive constant, a landscape of withered dreams and forgotten civilizations. Bane spoke little of the world before the fall, just clipped bits of information when necessity demanded it. That ridge, old highway, sometimes useful scrap. Or that plant, death bloom. One touch and you'll spend your last days screaming. The wardens, at first a constant terror lurking in the shadows, retreated in my mind as the struggle for simple survival consumed me. The Chip's phantom whine faded completely, replaced by the relentless pounding of my own heart. And just when I thought the desolation couldn't deepen, it did. We stumbled across a relic of the world before. A cluster of skeletal skyscrapers, half swallowed by shifting sands. Even stripped of their former glory, they were evidence of past ambition, now monuments to utter failure. Bane led me into those ruins, drawn by some inscrutable instinct I couldn't fathom. "Ferals," he grunted. "They make their nests here sometimes." Fear spiked in my gut. I imagined those the Chip couldn't control, their minds shattered and reformed into something else. Night fell while we were still amidst that concrete graveyard, forcing us to seek shelter in a hollowed-out shell of a building. Bane built no fire, offering only a cold strip of dried meat. "They smell smoke," he explained, his eyes gleaming in the dim moonlight filtering through the gaps in the ceiling. Sleep, as always, was troubled. The wind moaned and whispered through the ruins, and more than once I swore I heard skittering, scraping sounds alien to any creature I'd encountered in the open wastelands. Each time, I'd jolt awake to find Bane as still as a graveyard statue, his gaze trained on the darkness. Then it came. Not a creeping sound, but a sudden, deafening shriek that seemed to erupt from the walls. Bane was on his feet in an instant, his weathered hand gripping a long blade. I stumbled upright, disoriented, terror making clumsy work of my limbs. Then they were pouring from the shadows, hunched, scuttling shapes, eyes burning with a feral hunger. Not dozens, but scores, perhaps hundreds. What followed was a frenzy of snarls, blood, and the acrid stink of fear. Bane fought like a demon, blade flashing, but they were too many. I wasn't a warrior, just a desperate man fumbling for a weapon. Then, strong, calloused hands seized me, dragging me back, away from the seething mass. "Run, boy!" Bane's voice was a ragged shout over the din. "Run, and don't look back!" Run. It was a simple directive, but one my terror-stricken body struggled to obey. My legs churned, propelled by pure adrenaline-fueled panic, while the howls and the sound of tearing flesh chased at my heels. I tripped, sprawling, and clawed my way back up, the taste of copper and dust in my mouth. Stumbling and weaving, I crashed through the ruined cityscape. The shadows morphed into grasping shapes. My breath felt like sandpaper against my raw throat. I had no destination, no plan, just the blind need to put distance between myself and the horde that had consumed Bane. Hours later, I collapsed behind the twisted wreckage of some long-forgotten machine. My lungs burned, every muscle screamed in agony. But the certainty that I was still being pursued kept me from succumbing to the sweet oblivion of exhaustion. Dawn painted the wasteland in cold shades of grey. My body was a canvas of raw scrapes and bruises, my spirit a tattered shred of its former self. Bane was gone, consumed by the very nightmare he had warned me about. And even if by some miracle he'd survived, there was no way I could find him in this shattered expanse. I was alone, more alone than ever before. A wave of despair threatened to topple me completely. Back in the dome, there had always been structure, a safety net of sorts. Now there was nothing. No implanted chip whispering false comfort, no walls to offer an illusion of safety, no one to rely on but my own battered self. It was the harshest realization of all, and in that moment, I think a part of me wanted to simply curl up and let the wasteland claim me. But Bane hadn't died, so I could just give up. He'd paid with his life to give me a chance, one I would cling to with bloody fingernails and gritted teeth. I forced myself to stand. Each movement was an act of rebellion, a slap in the face of this cruel, uncaring world. I ate the last scraps of dried meat, foul and gritty as they were, and forced my trembling hands to fashion a crude spear from a shard of wreckage. I would not be easy prey, not if I had a say in it. When I finally started walking again, it wasn't survival that fueled my steps, but a bitter rage. Rage at the dome with its lies and its soul-suffocating tranquility. Rage at the wasteland for its relentless appetite for destruction. Most of all, rage at myself for ever thinking I could find some semblance of peace in a world that knew only brutality and endless struggle. My world shrank. No longer did I look at the horizon dreaming of distant havens. Now my focus was brutally practical. The next water source, the next edible scrub, the next vaguely safe place to steal a few hours of uneasy rest. My days became a relentless cycle of hunting, hiding, and the constant aching void of hunger. Bane's ghost clung to me. Not in any spectral sense, but in the lessons he'd beaten into my skull. I became an expert at reading the wasteland's subtle language, the shift of a sand dune that hinted at a buried hazard, the telltale scent of decaying meat that could mean predator or potential meal. My senses sharpened, honed like the edge of my scavenged spear. There were encounters, of course, other exiles, their eyes filled with suspicion, their hands never far from their own crude weapons. A few times I found evidence of the wardens, spent shell casings and hastily abandoned camps. I would not be recaptured. I would die out here first. I started leaving signs of my passage, crude traps broken cleanly, tracks deliberately blurred. My message to the wardens was silent, but clear. Come and get me. Time warped in the desert's relentless heat. Had it been weeks, months? My hair grew shaggy and unkempt. My scavenged clothing disintegrated into threadbare rags. Each day, I looked more and more like the ferals I so feared, The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Then came the storm. It began as a rumble on the horizon, then crashed towards me with the fury of a dying world. The wind bit at me, flinging grit in my face until I was blind and gasping. Frantically, I sought shelter, finding a shallow cave that was little more than a crack in a hulking stone monolith. I crawled inside and huddled there as the world exploded around me. For hours, or perhaps a full day and night, the storm raged. My fragile shelter offered little protection from the onslaught. Sand seeped in, choking me, and I wondered if this was how I'd end. Not in battle with the wardens, not with fangs in my throat, but buried alive under the indifferent weight of the wasteland. But the storm, like everything on this forsaken world, eventually exhausted itself. I emerged from my sandy tomb, battered and blinking against the sudden stillness. The wasteland was transformed. Dunes had shifted, revealing glistening black rock where there had been only blinding sand. And there, jutting from the side of a newly exposed cliff face, was the opening of a cave. Not a shallow cleft like my near-death trap, but a true tunnel, plunging into darkness. Fear quickly extinguished by something stronger, curiosity, or perhaps a need for a sanctuary more substantial than exposed rock. I took a trembling breath and stepped into the shadows. The cave was both salvation and a reflection of my deepest fears. Cooler air pressed against my parched skin like a ghostly caress. The darkness was absolute, disorienting, and it held the oppressive weight of untold centuries buried within the earth. With hands that trembled more from fatigue than fear, I scavenged a splintered spar of wood from my meager supplies. A sliver of hoarded fabric, a precious drop of the flammable resin I'd only dared use sparingly, and soon a pitiful torch sputtered to life. Its meager glow did little to combat the all-consuming blackness. The tunnel snaked downwards, the rough-hewn stone walls pressing in uncomfortably close. I inched forward, my spear held out before me as much for protection as for guidance. This was no natural formation. The floor was too even, the curves too deliberate. Remnants of a forgotten civilization, perhaps even older than the ruined skyscrapers and scorched plains outside. It carried the faint scent of age, a musty, ancient odor of dust and undisturbed stone. Every uneven breath, every scrape of my worn boots against the floor seemed amplified in the unnatural silence. The darkness bore down on me, threatening to smother the pathetic flame I clutched. But I pressed on. After the ceaseless exposure of the desert, where every move was a calculated risk and danger lurked behind every rock, the impenetrable obscurity of the cavern offered a strange, perverse kind of sanctuary. After a while, the passage started sloping upwards. A way out? Another entrance. But as I stumbled, blinking into the sudden influx of light, hope died as quickly as it was born. I was in a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in the gloom. The floor was choked with rubble and my blood ran cold. Bones. Human bones, unnaturally white against the dark stone, picked clean by time or scavengers. So this was where they came to die. The ones unlucky or unwise enough to venture too far from the dome, or perhaps those hunted down and cornered by the wardens. And then I saw it. A glint of metal amidst the skeletal debris. I crept closer, torch held high. A chip. An intact implant, dislodged and discarded, its faint hum now an audible sound of betrayal in the dead stillness of the chamber. Rage boiled up within me. The wardens, they didn't just chase us. They drove us into the darkest corners of this devastated world, left us to die in the shadows so the illusion of their perfect order wouldn't be shattered. I picked up the chip, its metallic coolness heavy in my hand. With a savage cry, I smashed it against the stone floor, again and again, until the delicate machinery shattered, and the relentless sound of control sputtered into silence. I spent the following days in that lightless chamber, a spectre haunting a tomb. The bones held no fear for me now, just a silent witness to the cruelty of the dome and the bitter price of its brand of manufactured peace. I roasted the meager game I managed to trap near the cave entrance, my solitude broken only by the crackle of the flames and the mournful howl of the wind at the tunnel's mouth. A perverse kind of resolve settled within me. Not peace, but the acceptance of my existence. The wasteland was not a temporary refuge, but my battlefield. The wardens were not spectres of my past, but my sworn enemies. The dome, for all its technology and engineered superiority, could not function without order, without the unquestioning obedience the chips implanted in their citizens' skulls. If I could disrupt that, sow seeds of rebellion, perhaps there was still a chance to strike back, to shatter the illusion that had poisoned so many lives. It wasn't a grand plan of rescue or salvation, but a gamble born from isolation and fueled by a burning need for some form of vengeance. With meticulous care, I sifted through the debris of the skeletal chamber. It was slow, painstaking work, illuminated by my pathetic torch. Each bone, each shard of rusted metal, passed through my hands. I sought not food or weapons, but knowledge. And, by the dying light of my scavenged torch, I found it. Scrawls marred the stone walls, barely legible under layers of dust and grime. Crude pictograms interspersed with frantic writing. Not the mindless scribblings of the ferals, but records left behind by the dying. Tales of escape, warnings, and, most crucially, a crude map. It depicted the tunnels I had stumbled upon. Not a natural formation, but part of an ancient network, a relic of whatever civilization had existed before the fall. These tunnels spiderwebbed beneath the land, some blocked by cave-ins or lost to time, others still passable. One, the scrawled note claimed, led back towards the dome. Now, I had a way to hurt the ones who had hurt me, to tear at the fragile threads of their meticulously crafted control. Leaving my haven in the burial chamber, I plunged deeper into the network of tunnels. The tunnels became my world. I learned to navigate them with the instincts of a burrowing creature, marking my path in blood and charcoal on the rough-hewn stone walls. Hunger ate at my belly. Thirst raged in my throat. But something far more potent fueled my determination. They'd turned me into a ghost, but now I would return to rattle their gilded cage. The map proved treacherous. Cave-ins and dead ends forced me to backtrack, to find perilous, narrow passages that tested my endurance to the breaking point. Time lost all meaning in the relentless blackness. Then finally the air changed, less stale, filled with the sterile tang of recycled air. The faint, underlying hum of machinery guided me. I was close. I emerged from the tunnels not in some grand entrance, but through a hidden maintenance shaft on the very periphery of the city. Blinking against the harsh, artificial light, I stumbled into a shadowy tangle of pipes and disused machinery. My wild appearance, ragged and caked in dirt, drew no notice in this forgotten underbelly. Moving through the shadows was as familiar as breathing once had been. Yet I saw my former home with new eyes, attuned to the subtle signs of unrest. A muttered conversation cut short, a hastily lowered gaze, the slight tremor in a technician's hand as he overrode a control panel. The seed of doubt had been sown deeper than the architects of this gilded prison could have imagined. The chips whispered their sweet lies, but the fear they'd so carefully buried was rising, a bitter tide. My mission now was to stoke that fear, to transform those hushed whispers into open defiance. The bone chamber had yielded more than a map. Amidst the records, I'd discovered the means to disrupt the pristine order, to send a shockwave through their system. The knowledge was a fire in my mind. Perhaps the fight wasn't over. Perhaps I wasn't merely a relic, but the spark that could ignite a rebellion. I had no illusions of single-handedly taking down the dome. That was a fool's dream, and I'd long since shed any naivete this brutal world had left me. But every system has its cracks, its pressure points. One strategically shorted power grid, one cleverly disrupted communication channel, a carefully orchestrated accident in the life support sectors. Chaos could be the weapon I wielded. My haven now was the shadowed labyrinth of the underbelly, its forgotten innards where discarded tech and whispers of dissent mingled. I survived on scraps, on the overlooked and the disregarded. I became the shadow haunting the city I'd once called home, a creature born of its cruelty, now bent on turning its own weapons against itself. And with every act of sabotage, every hint of panic in the eyes of an unsuspecting supervisor, I felt the ghost of Bane beside me, a bloody, approving grin on his weathered face. It started subtly, a glitch in the food replicators, rations dispensed double, then not at all. A hum through the comm systems that refused to be silenced. Life support failing in one sector, the sterile air filled with the scent of unfiltered panic. The dome was a finely tuned machine, and I, with my scavenged knowledge and burning hatred, was the grit in its gears. As the disruptions spread, whispers slithered through the once pristine corridors. The words rebellion, sabotage hissed in shadowed corners. They searched for the traitor, their eyes lingering on the discontented, the ones who dared to question. Then I struck at the heart of their control, the chips themselves, not physically, but with a carefully crafted surge of electricity, a disruption that sent their delicate systems screaming. And just as I'd hoped, the results were catastrophic. The chips didn't malfunction. They went haywire, the soothing hum replaced with a discordant shriek in the skulls of every man, woman, and child. The meticulously enforced calm shattered like thin ice. Some screamed, clutching at their heads, eyes wide with a terror that no implanted serenity could suppress. Others dropped to their knees, gibbering prayers to indifferent gods or begging for an end to the torment. A lucky few fell into merciful unconsciousness. The manufactured tranquility exploded into a maelstrom of raw, unfiltered humanity. Fear, rage, despair. Decades of suppressed emotions tore free, and the city descended into anarchy. There were no grand uprisings, no coordinated rebellions. Only the panicked scramble of animals suddenly released from their cages. Fights erupted, old grudges fueled by chip-fueled paranoia spilling into the streets. Lifelong neighbors turned on each other, their eyes burning with the madness of uncontrolled instinct. Systems failed, fires raged, and the dome, designed to nurture and protect, transformed into a brutal arena. And me? I watched from the shadows, the architect of their ruin. There was no joy in it, none of the righteous satisfaction I'd imagined. This place wasn't just walls and clean air. It was people. People I'd grown up with, worked with, shared the bland comfort of mandated existence alongside. Now their screams filled the air, a chorus to my victory. Bane, I knew, would have understood. This was never about saving the dome. It was about tearing down the system that turned men into sheep, even if the cost was monstrous. I'd won, but the world I surveyed from my shadowy perch showed how devastating victory could be. The wasteland stretched beyond, promising only hardship and death, while the dome descended into its own self-made hell. And somewhere, deep inside, where a fragment of my former self still clung to stubborn existence, I knew I wasn't the victor here, merely a survivor amidst the ruins of a world crumbling upon itself.